Уважаемые коллеги, я думаю, можем мы понемножку начинать, потому что у нас много спикеров, чтобы все успели выступить и, может быть...
Dear colleagues, I think we can start. We hope that we shall have enough time to cover at least several questions. Our session today will be about migration, modern migration to Russia, the resources and challenges, and the reasons why we have this name. Some time ago, the discussions around migration boiled down to the fact that society and probably the authorities did not really favor the migration topic, and rather were inclined to speak about barriers and hurdles, and now act as, well, protectors. So they advocate the benefits of migration and resources and only positive features. And now that the situation has changed and the hype subsided, now experts can turn face to face to the resources and challenges and speak honestly about the problems around this process, and especially the fact that now we are living in a situation, and yesterday I was listening carefully to the presentations. Maybe I missed something, but I never heard that, I never heard, with all the talks about demographic changes, about the problem that arose last year is the reduction of Russian population. We were talking about natural shrinking of population, birth rate, death rate, but the migration ceases to make up for natural decline of the population, while that fact has never been elucidated. So today we are going to speak about this problem, the way we consider it, and probably in return you share your opinion of the problem. So today we have invited many experts from different areas in order to consider the problem from many angles. Olga Chudinovsky, head of Lab of Demographic Trends of Moscow State University, Jamar Tatarbayev, Prime Minister of Kyrgyzia in 2014-2015, Nikita Mkrtchan, leading expert of RANEPA, Forecast Institute, and then our expert, Deputy Minister of Expert Council of Integration and Migration Council of Germany, Professor of Duisburg University, Karina Pipe, head researcher of Levada Center, and Yevgeny Varshavek from RANEPA, too, or Urban Center of RANEPA. So, today, at our session, we shall hear the speeches first, and we have 12 minutes per person, per speaker. And in the end, when I will be showing you the 2 minutes and then 0 minutes paper, so that we could have time to hear all the presentation and then have a discussion. So let us start with Nikita Mkrtchan, who briefly will give us the statistics in migration and probably say a couple of words about his opinion on his forecast of the future. Thank you. May I have my first slide? So Julia has already told us that we are going to have deficiencies in the population dynamics. Unfortunately, again, we are approaching zero. We actually had an upsurge of the population, which migration, in some cases, could compensate only very rarely, could hardly compensate, and especially during the demographic uprise in the at the end of the last century. We even had some population growth, but now we are coming back to the situation when migration is not capable to make up for the negative population growth, and we have been writing about it. 2018 will probably be the first year after a long break when, since 2008, when the population of Russia shrinks again. And it's not going to be kind of a statistic error. It's not that it falls but then grows again. It is probably a kind of a number of years when the population is dropping. Hopefully it will not be as dramatic as in the 90s and early 2000s, but still we can see this factor. And once migration doesn't drop either, we would probably have the situation later. But the circumstances are that it's in exactly 2018 that gave us a poor situation in the population statistics. So migration surplus. So look at the migration trend. Let me again say that the main donors for migration into Russia are the post-Soviet countries. Almost 30 years ago, the Soviet Union has collapsed. And we had a period of burgeoning growth. Other countries developed in different ways, but there was not a single country a new country who could be named as a migration donors. There were many scarecrows in that respect, like China or Southeast Asian countries, but we wouldn't say that they could really become a source of migrants to make up for the other donors, like Baltic countries, Moldavia, Ukraine, and somehow make up for this growth through probably migrants from many countries outside the post-Soviet space. It would be good if we could manage this process, facilitate, probably introduce some quotas, maybe change our positions on citizenship. We could probably facilitate the process, but it doesn't happen. And the migration surge that the migration that really shrank in 2018 is similar to the situation of 2015 after the events in Ukraine that happened. And you can see those blue columns is what Ukraine gave us. At a certain moment, there was a quick surge of migrant inflow. Ukraine has been our main migration donor over the last 2 to 3 years, and now 2018, it kind of backfired. A large inflow of migrants who register at their location. If a person registers for 1, 2 to 3, 4 years, then one day this registration expires, and many migrants from Ukraine who came, registered in 2015 and 14 now have expired. And the inflow of migrants in Russia has not become lower than during previous years, but outflow has grown. I won't be surprised if next year, at least in the first 6 months, we probably may have even negative migration with Ukraine, just like negative migration to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. No, Russians didn't go to Uzbekistan. It was the outflow of the migrants who had come earlier. And so we had a short-term negative numbers. So the standard volume of migration have not returned. So we observe the negative numbers in our migration with Ukraine. So it's approximately 150,000 of people for Russia is the reality. And it's not clear when it's going to be over. Now our main donor, as you can see, which has never been, is Tajikistan. It's not Ukraine, not Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, for the reasons that they have stopped their migration. Why is it so dramatic? Because our population is not just reducing. Yeah, it may be 100,000 or 200,000 people a year, but actually the problem is that the active age population is shrinking, and it will keep shrinking, probably at lower pace compared to the previous years, like 1 million people a year. But we expect this trend to continue, and the forecast that Ross Statistics Agency is making says that with the current working age, not the current, but the previous working age before June, before the pension reform, the active age population is going to shrink as well, to keep shrinking and reach a certain plateau. And according to the scenario, we expect it to have 300,000 people by 2025, or maybe 125,000 people. The growth at the level of the 90s. Where do you expect to get it from? What? It's unclear. So the situation is quite poor with the working age population. That's why we needed this pension reform to help the demographic trend and the labor market. We might think that we could fix the problem with the temporary labor migration, which is actually being done. We have approximately 4 million people officially working in Russia, people who came to be employed. And this number has been quite sustainable over the last 5 years. And we could even see some growth in 2018, year on year. But again, these are the CIS countries. No matter how much we try to attract people from from other countries, the skill export, we had measures but unfortunately, in the new economic situation, the number of migrants from the far away countries so is shrinking dramatically. So again, who are our conventional donors then? Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. So the Asian countries, the Middle Asia. And that's our labor markets. That's the people we can count on in the future. I'm done. Thank you. Especially for making it within your time slot. Now we have Olga Chudinovskih. May I have my presentation, please? So Nikita was speaking about temporary types of migration which are prevailing. But in order to support the permanent population count, we need a long-term migration. And one of the elements of migration policy is the Russian citizenship policy. So let me tell you about the specifics and risks in my presentation. So recently a new law has been passed, signed by Mr. Putin, that has not actually found enough coverage in mass media or among experts. At the end of last year, this law was passed with a kind of neutral and quite acceptable definitions to expand the authority of the president for the simplified beneficial citizenship provision. So with the explanatory note, we see that, well, actually the feeling changes. So the reason why the president was convinced to sign this law, so to provide, to award Russian citizenship to the people in the countries with the turbulent political situation. Name me.
So, but we can see it in all countries. So then we're talking about the people who have already migrated or still only continuing to live in their own country of origin and planning to come to Russia. And so we'll go back to this slide. So some numbers. So then in the post-Soviet period, so the Russian citizenship has been granted to 9 million people. And so this is the this is the information. So we know that for sure, that so they came to Russia and lived there for a while, and then they went for Russian citizenship. And about 7 million out of 9 got the citizenship altogether, and in 2018. And then from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 2.5 million. So every year through our consulates, not 10, 20, but almost 50,000 people so come to Russia asking for the citizenship along the lines of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, this is the remaining 7 million people. So then 40 people who obtained Russian citizenship were the former citizens of Kyrgyzia. So this table actually gives you statistics in the last year, so this official statistics of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and it tells us that and what they say that so you have to wait for the 8 years to get the Russian citizenship and have the temporary residence permit. So that's what they're saying. This is the standard procedure, and so that the main arguments how to simplify citizenship, and because 8 years is too much. But several hundreds of thousands of people get citizenship in simplified, speeded up procedure. So hundreds of thousands so getting. So just from Kazakhstan, Belarus, so citizens just could come to Russia and then 3 months later got the Russian passport. So I don't know what kind of difficulties they're talking about. So when they saw this from one citizenship to another citizenship, it took only 3 months. And I think it's quite simple. And it's not difficult at all. So it takes only 3 months just to get the Russian citizenship. And so then the categories of people who are getting. So the main reason why they so if they participate in the program of providing support to migrate the former Russians, the Russians who were living in another country, so they are moving to Russia, and so if they are within this program, so they're called our co-patriots. Should we be happy with this or not? So if they are co-patriots and then they are being relocated to Russia, so they get the simplified residence citizenship. Then 2009 to 40,000 in 2017. Those are spouses of the Russian Federation, whose marital relationship status lasted more than 3 years, so that's actually without the sincerity of these unions, so then the co-patriots and spouses, so this is not typical, and in other countries, so this cannot exist. So then co-patriots. Co-patriots, so certainly can be happy that the indicators of the state program are on the rise and more people are coming. But starting from 2014, all this labor migration and the permanent migration, residence or citizenship, all of them, those were the migrants most of the time from Ukraine, so forced migrants from Ukraine. And so then, actually, they immediately were allowed to participate in the state program. So once they get into the state program, they easily could obtain Russian citizenship, and that is why they did not support the forced migrants who really needed to migrate. And so then the state program it's quite hypocritical, because on the one hand, was saying that we're just bringing back the Russians from other countries, and just bringing the Russian cultured population to Russia. But if you read the conditions and the terms of participation in the program, you will find very strict pragmatic conditions contingent on the economic migration. If there is no profession or the age is not good, then the state program immediately refuses them. And so this is very bad. And so spouse migration works. And what does it teach us? So same thing as in case of the state program. So if in Russia there are not any other channels of long-term migration, if there are none, and because the state, besides the state program, there are no other programs. So people have to adjust to the conditions provided by the Russian legislation. So they act as compatriots. They act as they pretend to be compatriots. Or either they have to sign fictitious marriages. Sham marriages, and so the share of those sham marriages is very high. But once we get the register of the population, we'll get the statistics of divorce statistics between those spouses once they achieve their ends and become citizens of Russia. And so unfortunately, there is then the so-called those who speak the Russian-speaking people. Russian-speaking people. Unfortunately, there's no special program. Which, if you speak Russian, you're in for the Russian citizenship. And the people are trying just to use any possibility in order to simplify the access to Russia and obtaining the Russian citizenship. And so this long-term migration program, unfortunately, is too complicated. So lots of people who apply for Russian citizenship, they fail the tests for the Russian language, for the knowledge of the Russian language. So they fail the test. And the majority of those who become are not Ukrainians, but Tajikistan citizens. So for some reason, although they do not speak English, they still pass the test of the Russian language, and Ukrainians don't pass the Russian test. And they says, then the rules of the highly qualified professionals actually should be provided. So easy terms of obtaining Russian citizenship, but it's not the case. Although we expected that certain engineer should be given preference over a worker, but not. Then not a single simplified Russian citizenship program was applied to those people. Maybe it makes sense to set up more comfortable conditions for residence permit, and so because for businessmen it's more risky to have Russian citizenship rather than to live abroad, because it might be dangerous. So, for example, for businessmen, when they settle disputes, I think that a foreigner is better protected than a Russian citizen. So these norms don't work for business too. So then the coefficients of naturalization. So naturalization factor. So foreigners from the EU and other countries, so they are not trying to become Russian citizens. That is why we need to simplify residence permit for them, this is what they're after. They don't want to become Russian citizens, and that is why we need to study it to a greater extent, because in modern conditions, so we do not provide the EU residents who would want just to come and stay in Russia. So this new mechanism was providing residence permit, and that would be a good way out. And it's not growing because from the CIS countries, certainly they want Russian citizenship, and so this system is stagnating, and it's not properly developed. It's not properly appointed. So then getting Russian residents, Russian citizenship through foreign institutions, consulates. So every year, consulates actually acquire about 60,000 people acquire Russian citizenship through foreign consulates. But those are the people who would never come to live in Russia, although they get Russian passports. And then certainly the consulate reports say that more than half of the Transnistria citizens this is Transnistria, not Moldavia. And half of them have Russian passports, and they have Ukrainian passports, Moldavian passports, Romanian passports. They don't plan to come to Russia because a Russian passport is another pragmatic solution in selecting their own residence. Then economic implications. So how we grant Russian citizenship. So there is even such term as passportization. And so then they speak about the expansion, but actually, so besides economic burden, Russia does not gain anything. We're not getting any political dividends. So then the people who come to Russia and get Russian citizenship, they cannot influence the results of our elections, but they all like our pensions. So look at the statistics, and so then the second place number of Russian pensions abroad is Abkhazia. So they're getting Russian pensions. Abkhazia. So there is no. So then Abkhazia never provided any workers just that would come to the central Russia. But immediately once they got the Russian passports, they immediately applied for Russian pensions. And in Abkhazia. So the legislation in recent years continues this destructive role of this diluting selective Russian citizenship presentation. And they talk about the oversimplifying, continue to simplify, so providing Russian citizenship to all the people. And they don't realize the economic implications. They understand the political implications, social implications, and so economically we don't stand to gain anything. So because once they get their passports immediately, so they're in for the support provided by the state, the pensions, and so that is why the Russian state does not stand to gain anything from this migration organized in this fashion. Yet we need to stop using. Providing Russian citizenship as a main regulator of migration policy. We need to develop new institutes of temporary residence and residence permit. So we need to develop these institutions, and we need just to narrow down granting Russian citizenship through consulates located in other countries. We need just to stop it, or as possible, just to bring it to an end. And all these initiatives need to be the subject of the discussion by the experts. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So that certainly generated lots of issues, lots of questions. So now just let's see, and from another angle. So let's talk about so then a donor country, Jomart Atarbayev, Prime Minister of Kyrgyzia, 2014-2015. Let's get his take. I am the only non-specialist, nevertheless I'll try to offer you my opinion, because we'll look just from another side. Let's look at this problem, this challenge might be of interest to hear me out. This subject of migration is unique, and so I usually, when I make my presentations, I discuss different issues, but the main task for me is to meet the specialists, to get their takes, to see their position on this subject. Why? And because the subject of migration so will continue to be a very salient, important, and main issue for many more years to come. And so what we talk about, social economic development of the country is very important. And so let me say why migration plays such an important role. So there's three subjects I want to cover. So first is why for Kyrgyzstan this is a very important subject. So long term, very important. Let me tell you about that. So then I will take time to tell you what the difference between Kyrgyz migration and Tajik and Uzbek migration. Why there is a difference? Because I went into this subject, and as a politician, as a scientist, I went into it. And so what is there a difference? And so but there is a difference, I think. And then the third, what's going to happen later? What's going to happen in one generation, 2 generations? And so what will happen to the Kyrgyz migrants? And how they will impact Russian situation and Kyrgyz situation. Why it's so important? Because recently Kyrgyzia is much faster. It's on place number 1 related to the share of so money transfers as a share of GDP. So we take the first place in the world. So 35% of Kyrgyz GDP is formed by the money transfers from Russia. And $3 billion. So it's bigger than our budget, actually, if you say. So it's not 35%. It's even more than that. Can you imagine? So we take the first place in the world. So that's the reason why migration is so important. Why we need to understand and it's somehow to respond to the situation. And then, so then another very important point. So there are strengths and weaknesses, as usual, and so then up to 20–30% of working population, able person, they are in Russia or in Kazakhstan, which is not good. It's up to 30% of labor. So economically and brain drain, this is not good. But there are other factors. But the most important is the factor is the social stability. So we're fighting unemployment. So that's a key factor, because it helps to reduce unemployment, and that's positive part of migration. Then political aspects. So we talk about what Russia is getting politically from migrants. So there are only two things. So someone became part of EU, European Economic Union, and so then the public opinion in Kyrgyzia supported 80% of it supported. So then the creation of this union, mostly because so the migrants' status would change immediately for the better, and that's true. So when we joined in 2015, everything changed quite considerably. So it's political aspect, very good for Kyrgyz. Then certainly, so that Kyrgyz actually they're the best to speak Russian. So, but after they became members of this EU, so the interest to learn Russian has rocketed, and actually no one comments whether we need to learn Russian. It's a given thing. We need to learn Russian. We must learn Russian, and this is very good. And so then another thing that I watched, so then migration from the Central Asia. What's the difference? Central Asia, because we need to develop so the political measures. So then some time ago, just from the viewpoint of so money transfers were 2-3 times less than Tajiks or Uzbeks. Now, so GDP wise, so we are ahead of Uzbekistan from the viewpoint of money transfers, and why? Because we studied the social condition of the Kyrgyz, and so many just go to go to the service sector. So instead of construction or services, so they go to services because they know Russian very well and they're motivated. So they just go higher and get better salaries. They go to the service economy in Russia. And these so fluctuations with the Kyrgyz migrants is minimal. So this volatility is minimum. So unlike our Tajik and Uzbek neighbors, so they know Russian much better. That's first thing. Another, what's very important, and that the Kyrgyz do not marry Russian women. They don't marry Russian women. Only 500 a year marry Russian women. Why? Because in the migration era, so there is gender equality everywhere. The Kyrgyz living in Russia, so they marry each other because gender equality. So Kyrgyz woman, Kyrgyz man, they marry together. So there is a balance, and there is no need. So then there is no need just to marry for the sake of getting a Russian citizenship, right? So because 90% from are men, so from Tajikistan, because this is not normal. So because there's 90% of migration to Tajikistan is men. So no, but we have almost equal, and so they come and marry here, and so then the EU access is wonderful because the European Eurasian Union access is very important. That's a very good contributor.
For money transfer, average money transfer to Kyrgyzia is double as to the Uzbekistan. So they earn twice as much and feel quite good, quite sustainable. And one more thing I want to tell you that will probably be of interest to you, that migration of Kyrgyz into Russia may become an exemplary, a benchmark of the proper migration of non-Slavic population into Russia. We saw that Uzbeks, migrate here in fourfold volumes. There are four times more Uzbeks. But our migration allows people to use the social lift to go up the social career and be involved in the education and culture of Russia. There are many benefits. That's the second aspect, in my personal view, why we are slightly different. And the third aspect, what next? And that's where I want to refer to sociological research. Several years ago, the Russian polling agency, a Russian polling agency, made a survey asking Kyrgyz, my compatriots, how long they are going to stay and where the motherland is. And 90% said that we are temporary here. And our motherland is back in Kyrgyzstan, over 90%. But in fact, we should take this emotional poll, we should think deeper. So I also tried to see what's going to happen. Are they going to return or not? Economic potential of Russia is much higher. Cultural, humanitarian, and other. People will have within the next decades, people will earn more and get more. and now children have finished schools. So they have become integrated. They go to universities, they start working, get skills, and go up. But still, they do not consider Russia their motherland. What's going to happen then? And I will take the liberty to say, in my view, the picture of the future position of Kyrgyz and Russia will be similar to the situation with the Turks, Turkish people in Germany. Why? Because not many of them probably consider Germany their country. Many of them keep the voting rights and keep stay connected to their historical motherland. And I think that within the next generation, the position of Kyrgyz people in Russia will be similar. And in this respect, the forecast may be similar as well. I would like to know, I keep reading, yeah, with the Turkish community in Germany. We need to use their experience, both positive and negative. And I even think that it will be easier for us, meaning that our common history, our common country, the Soviet Union, which actually raised several generations. And so this path will be easier for us to take. So I would like to wrap up wishing we could study this problem better and probably study from you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I believe that we may have a chance of discussion at this session. I see already the expressions on the faces of some experts, and we have a unique opportunity to hear firsthand about the experience of Germany, which actually the Russian mass media discuss a lot, kind of trying to scare our own population. But now we can probably hear about the real situation in Germany.
Especially integration of Turkish migrants in Germany. So it's a good point. I'm a psychological expert from my profession, and I will give you in the short time the following points. At first, what are the psychological processes of integration of migrants? Then look to Germany. What is the situation in Germany? We make every 2 years an integration barometer, the felt integration in Germany. I will discuss with you some of the results, and especially focusing on the result, what are the criteria for belonging to society? And at last, I will formulate some consequences for politics and society. I think I'm the only non-Russian speaker here. Excuse my English, it's my second or third foreign language. I'm Turkish origin, and German is my mother language. So if you look on a general view to some trends or patterns of migration, we can identify at least 5 general patterns. At first, a globalization of migration. So nowadays, more and more countries are affected by international migration. It's not the US or Europe, a lot of countries, for example, Russia too. Second, we have a differentiation of migration. It's not only labor migration, which was long time dominant form of migration. We have family reunion, we have refugee movements, we have permanent settlements, and so on. And sometimes the motives are changing. Someone comes, for example, as a refugee and stay there. So motives of migration changes. Another point is that we have no clear distinction between emigration and immigration countries. Some countries are emigration, immigration, and transit countries too. For example, Turkey. Nowadays, Turkey was long time an immigration country. Nowadays, it is an immigration country too. There are living more than nearly 3.5 million Syrian refugees and nearly 500,000 Iraqi refugees. also refugees from Iran and Afghanistan too. The estimated rate is round about 6 or 7 million people living in Turkey, but also living more than 5 million Turks abroad. So Turkey is transit, emigration, and immigration country. The same is true for Spain, for Greece, for Mexico too. A lot of Mexicans living in the US, but a lot of Latin Americans living in Mexico. So Mexico is a transit and emigration and immigration country. So I think a little bit, as you mentioned, is true for Russia too. It's not only an emigration country. In Germany, there are nearly 5 to 6 million people coming from former Soviet Union. But now we heard that a lot of people from former Soviet Unions living in Russia. So the clear distinction between emigration and immigration country is no more obvious. The fourth point is we have a feminization of labor migration, especially since 1960s. There is a rapidly increasement of the part of the woman. Long time it was a male-dominant migration. And the last point, we see, especially in the last years, a growing politicization of migration. That means that migration plays an increasing role, both in domestic politics as well as in international or bilateral political relationships, maybe Turkey-EU deal, or the uprising of right-wing parties in Germany, in Austria, in Netherlands, which have as main political idea the instrumentalization of migration. So migration plays a great role in politics too. These are some general trends. I will come to a second, and I think this is the most complicated slide, but I will focus on, especially on the individual level. John Berry, one of the famous researchers from the psychological point of view on acculturation, tried to focus on aspects which explain acculturation. Acculturation means to have an equilibrium between person and new environment. And we have to look on two central aspects. Aspects which are prior to acculturation. People have an history. People are not even born in the new country. They bring a history. And aspects which are relevant during the acculturation. What are these? Especially age is a central aspect. If you come to a new country at an age of 3 or 30, makes a difference. Learning the language, having friendship with inhabitants in a former age is much better than maybe with 20 or 30. Gender plays a role, education, pre-acculturation. That means you have experience with acculturation, with internal acculturation in your own country. Do you come from, for example, from a East Anatolian village to Munich, or you have a migration experience from an East Anatolian village to Istanbul, to Ankara, to a big city, and then come to Germany? Makes a difference. And I think the same is true, for example, for Russia too. Which status do you have? What are the migration motives? Is it a voluntary migration or forced migration? What are your expectancies about this new country? Also, aspects like cultural distance, language, religion. For example, coming as a Swede or Netherlands or Dutch person to Germany makes difference than coming as a Turk or a Syrian or Iranian to Germany. So language and cultural differences, but also some psychological aspects. Locus of control, that means what people think, what is the cause of their action? Has it to do with their own aspirations, own actions, or are the other to blame for success or failure? And the second block are the phase, length of time, what kind of acculturation strategies do you have? Are you open? Are you living in segregated areas? Which kind of coping strategies do you have? Coping means, in psychological science, how people deal with difficulties in their life. Do you go to an expert? Do you drink alcohol? Do you take medicine? Or so on. And there are a lot of different kinds of dealing with difficulties. Social support means how great is the ethnic community? Are you one of the pioneer migrant? For example, my parents, as they come in the 60s and 70s to Germany, or if you come nowadays to Berlin, to Munich, to Köln, as a Turkish or a Greek or Spaniard, then you will have, the difficulties are much, much easier because there are established communities. How great is the community? And last but not least, what are the attitudes of the receiving or of the receiving country? How great, how intensive are discrimination, racism, xenophobia, or is it an open society? These all is relevant for understanding as a long term the adaptation, the new being at home in the new country. That means acculturation. So after this short theoretical introduction, I will come to Germany. We have in Germany nearly 82 million residents. 10% of them are foreigners, but more than 20%, 22% have a migration background. For example, me, I am a German citizen, but have a migration background because my parents came in this end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s to Germany. The most of migrants in Germany are EU migrants, more than 70%. Nearly 2/3 of them are from the EU countries, 2% from North and South America, nearly 4% from Africa, and 17% from Asia, Oceania. If you look to Germany, we have, and you see the eastern and western part, we have a clear dominance of the western, of the former western part, as a receiving of migrants, with the exception of Berlin. Berlin, you know, was a divided city. West Berlin was part of Western Germany, and East Berlin was part of the Eastern Germany. The rates of foreigners in the eastern part tends between 5 and 7%. But on the other side, in the former western part, especially in Hessen, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and so on, we have migrant rates between 25 and 30%. So nearly every third of the people have a migration background. So it's a real challenge for labor market, for education, and so on. Especially for education, I think this slide I will go on. Especially for the education market, you see that at the age of 5 to 15, nearly 1/3 of the people have a migration background. In some parts, for example, in Berlin, in some areas, at schools, the migration rate varies between 18 to 19%, for example, in Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and so on. That means that especially for the education area, we have a huge challenge with multilingualism, with multicultural identity, with a multi-religious identity. What we mean when we speak about integration, especially in the expert council, we understand integration as equal opportunity of participation in the key areas of social life. That means the labor market, the educational market, the political participation, the acceptance. If you try to figure out what is the success of integration, then you should look to the rates of participation, for example, in the labor market, educational market. If there is no difference, then you can say integration is going well. If the differences are permanent and great, then we have a task to steer integration or to make integration better. I will come to my third point, to the integration barometer, to the felt integration in Germany. It's a multilingual survey. It's representative, and we adjusted to the real population by weighting factors, and have selected the respondents randomly. So methodologically, there's, I think, no problem. We asked people without a migration background, with migration background, and with different migration background. There is one notion what is very difficult to translate Spätaussiedler, that means people coming from the former Soviet Union with German ancestry. So it's, there's a fixed term in German, but it's very, very difficult to translate. We asked people from Turkey, we asked people from the EU countries and from the rest of the world. And so if you want to give a school grade for integration in Germany, then I think we would give in Germany 2 minus 3 plus. That means it's good, but it's not good enough. 0 means it's worse, it's bad, and 100% would mean that it's perfect. We have in several years rates between 65 to 70%. So that means it's okay, but there is a little bit to do. But with the exception of one group, people from Turkey. People from Turkey has a very skeptical attitude that integration in Germany, their integration in Germany is not very well. To the special causes, maybe I can say something in the discussion. We asked in the special areas, in the community, labor market, social ties, and education. And you see there are nearly values a little bit about 50%, 55 to, 70%. Last, my fourth point, belonging. What defines belonging to society? Work and nationality, or bloodlines and ancestry. And I will come to the sum up. Belonging to society is especially viewed that people are working. I think, it's the next, no? Doesn't work? Oh. So, belonging to society, to have a permanent job and to have German citizenship are the most relevant aspects. And I think this is a very positive message. It's not to be a Christian, it's not to be born in Germany or have German ancestors, because if would be to be a Christian is the marking point to belonging, then you can't change, you can't convert. Or if to be born in Germany, you can't change it. But the main aspect is to have a permanent job and to have German citizenship are the relevant aspects. We have little differences, especially in the unemployment rates. We see that especially the labor market, the unemployment rate of people without migration background is doubled than with people without migration. It's 8%. And if we asked which groups are the unwanted neighbors, toward which groups are the most hesitances, rejections, and there are Roma, people coming from the former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria. These groups are the most unwanted groups in Germany, and especially from people from the former Soviet Union, Spätaussiedler. They rejected Roma at most. I come to my last point. We, in our annual report, we formulated some consequences for politics and society. I will mention just some of them. Use the crisis of European refugee and asylum to bring about reforms. Risk more Europe was one of our recommendations. Distribute responsibility within Europe. Partnership with transit countries are important steps. Promoting voluntary return, carry out deportations if they are if we should do it, then do it quickly and humanely. Preserve 2 legal tracks, don't mix asylum and labor migration. Integrate refugee children as quickly as possible in standard school structures. Vocational education and should be more flexibly. Use standard structures to integrate refugees into the labor market. Recognize more informal qualifications, not just look on certificates, because for example, Syrian or Ukrainian or Russian or Iraqi refugees have not even the certificates, but have qualifications. They have competencies. Make use of domicile requirement in the city and in rural regions. And last point, communicating values is important, but internalizing values requires shared practice and social participation. You can't teach values, you can't teach culture. It needs more contact and it needs more time. Give time for acculturation and facilitate social interaction in everyday life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Now our next presentation from Levada Center will allow us to have a look at how the society regards migrants. Let's see how they regard migrants, because the media negative wave has subsided, and so let's see how the society responds to the presence of migrants in Russia. And I will talk. So what the Russian population think about migrants? So do they think that we need migrants, or they adhere to the myths and they don't want to see any migrants in their country? So then the statistics it's outside the public opinion, but we just practically are asking people, individuals, Russians. So all the information, it's the results of studies of adult population of Russia. Let's see what their responses are. So the first slide tells us about the dynamics of public opinion vis-a-vis what kind of policy Russia should adhere to concerning labor migrants. So look at the most recent data, July 2018, 2/3 of the Russians, so they're against labor migration. So they say that labor migration should be limited. So the only time when there was a balance of 50-50, pro and contra, that was July 2002, when there was no consensus in the public opinion. So there were two groups, pro and contra, but there's a trend. That anti-migration trend is on the rise and still there. And I'm not going to go into details why it's going up, but possible explanation and the dates in red will see that the maximum increase of this anti-migrant was in October 2013, March 2016. And as the professor was saying correctly, so then the political populist rhetoric certainly impacts the integration process and the awareness and the perception of the Russians vis-a-vis migrants. And so then there were elections, there were events, and that certainly impacted the public opinion. Now just it's kind of going down, flattening out a little bit, but it's still high. And then, so then we can just put different questions to the Russians about migrants. How to phrase the question, very important. And so then this is 2017, July 17 data, because we can ask different questions. For example, because are you for migration or against migration? And and then you'll see that people more often they say they provide their opinion whether they like migration or don't like migration. But once we say neutral position, so for example, do we need Russian migrants? So then immediately it goes up to 1/3. So that if you put the neutral question, you get a different answer. And so that's because the studies may be different and they can use different methodology. So if they don't care, for example, they say, so then if you just go deeper, then you certainly will have an opinion. Although on the surface they always say, I don't care about this problem of migration. And those who are neutral to migration, if you go deeper, so they talk about the negative. They speak negatively about migration if you start grilling them for real answers. And then if you ask, for example, about so the image, how we perceive, what are the myths around labor migrants? if we break them into categories, we can see that the low qualified, low educated labor. That's the main perception. But we should not go to extremes and say that we're xenophobic. No, we're not xenophobic. And so sometimes you can just come across positive responses. So positive and negative would be but more or less equal, 50 pro, 50 against. But the negative myths, so they are stronger. And so the first thing, the main image, low unqualified workers or criminals and fraudsters, and so unfortunately, so many people share this opinion. Unfortunately, so the only thing that in 2017 and so in the last 10 years, negative characteristics are on the rise. So the negative opinions. As we know, that the labor migrants may be different. So then the territory of exodus, where they came from. We can see the origin. So then two groups. First group are the regions and the states from which the migrants, labor migrants, and they like them from Belarus, from Ukraine, other regions, so where there is preponderance of Russian population, those migrants are welcome in Russia. So let's call this a very close ethnic background and Russian background, cultural background. And the second, so that are less wanted or almost unwanted from the viewpoint of Russian population. And they say that we do not like them. And so that the Caucasus, Middle Asia, Central Asia, and from the Northern Caucasus. So they're not wanted, the migrants from those countries. And so there's two different exodus flows, and the treatment is different. So identify these two groups. But ideally, this index should try to get to the level of 180. But unfortunately, those who we like, so it's only the index is only 120. It means that the attitude, even to your own migrants, like we said, from Belarus, culturally common, still the index is not. It does mean that it's dominating in the positive sense, and so people are still apprehensive even of those migrants. So when we state, so what is it that makes you mad with migrants? So when we start asking questions of that kind, so then says countries, they're donor, and so then first place is in the opinion of the Russians. So cultural, ethnical factor is very salient. So they don't want to conform, they don't respect our rights. So they do not behave. They're loud. They're dangerous. And so that's when the migrants, so they make themselves conspicuous in a negative sense. That certainly immediately generates this negative response. Then very popular, so that the migrants compete with the local population for jobs, and so they're everywhere at all markets, at all bazaars. There are only migrants, and they steal from us, and etc. But the problem is much deeper, because other studies show that so there's unemployment and low income is the most important social concern of our citizens, because they're afraid that their jobs are being stolen from them, and but it goes much deeper. Now look at that people only 9% of the people said, so nothing makes me mad, so nothing exasperates me, I'm happy. Only 11% said that so they like the migrants. Then migrant phobia, so it's always around this aura around the migrants. And so we can see that this popular position, there's migrants that steal our jobs. That's every other person, 50% thinks so. Then the second popular myth, not only for Russia but for other countries, the myth of migrant crime. So 30% think that the migrants that come to us, so they did commit crimes twice as often as other. But it's very easy to fight those myths because so if you go to the Ministry of Interior site, and you will see that the crimes committed by the migrants is very little, very little. Migrants commit very few crimes. And all these feelings sometimes are irrational. These feelings, this awareness, irrational, because 50% recognize that in the last 5 years, so they've never been in contact with migrants, but 70% don't like them, although they have never come in contact with them. So these xenophobic feelings, they run high. And so then 80% say that they treat them negatively. So then it's not behavior of the migrants, because the experts can talk about integration, about the necessity of integration, but so we need just certainly to talk to the Russians and tell them. So if the population continues to think that it's all the migrants' fault, then how can you change the so this integration program? If there is a general negative attitude to the migrants, how can you so break down this wave of negative feelings? And we need to change that. So I'm a sociologist, and this is a sociological part. So sociology is not only migration problems. There are many other challenges. Trust is another. And so then one slide that tells us about, it's no secret that the trust between migrants and the Russians so has come to the fore, and then the reduction of this trust is noted by many institutions, and it's still there. And this lack of trust. And so that's why we need to increase this person-to-person trust. And it's a good potential just to slow down these negative feelings of the Russians towards the migrants. Yeah, because if people trust each other, then certainly the attitude between of the Russians will definitely change for the better. And effectively. So to change this public opinion is quite difficult, and we'll need just to do everything to try to do that if there is a chance. Thank you, Karina. And we are so we started with the statistics. Now just we spoke with about donor countries, international experience, public opinion, and now we're going back to Russia. And so now just we need to see how the second generation of migrants feel themselves being in Russia. So when Julia was saying that, then Mr. Otorbayev made sense, although sometimes it goes counter a little bit to the studies that we've made. So the assumption that I would like to make my argument upon is that the young people who were born educate, so they think that Kyrgyzstan is their motherland. I do not agree, because judging by the studies we have made, so this migrants, only less than half of the people who were born in Russia, migrants who were born, so they think Russia is their country. And so then 80%, that's actually 80% of the migrants from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, they regard Russia as their motherland. That's the change of so both Kyrgyzstan and so let's take it step by step. So that's why I do not agree with Mr. Otorbayev on that. So in 2005, when there were so public unrest in France, so they started thinking, what will happen to the migrants of the second generation in Russia, just like it was happening in France in 2005? So then, if they were born, if they were born in Russia or finished school, for example, finished school in Russia. So then there were several myths. There was a fear that integration, the second generation, will never happen. Everyone, but the first generation migrants never integrated properly, but the second generation migrants would integrate. There are children who speak the language very well, and so there would be even more useful members of the society than the representatives of the native Russians, for example. And so without this information from 2005, we could not make any conclusions, because so then the second generation was only in primary schools. But now just we're beginning to make some conclusions already, because they've grown up. So the migrants of the second generation, Middle Asia, Caucasus, what's their fate in the labor market, in educational area, because they've grown already in 2005. So young adult age, because they have already reached that age. The 2005 was too early. Well, let's see those structural integration, so cultural integration, so then related to the knowledge of the Russian language, or when they identify themselves as the Russians already. So how they just relate to themselves and think what they are. So there was a big study that was launched. We used different methods to evaluate that, and so there was a study. So targeting, social media, polling we used as well. So the method that actually the second generation was accurately and sincerely could be covered, yes, and to see how they do. So through the media, social media was very good. So when they interviewed many second-generation migrants from the regions, and so this is the methodology, and here are the results. Okay, you can always read our publications a little bit. So now let's see the results. And so first question that says a professor from Germany was saying. So then the income. If the income is the same as the local population, if the income is the same, then integration has taken place. Education, same. And then from the Caucasus, migrants from the Caucasus. So when we say we presume that they are younger, that's why they make less money, and they're remembering all the aspects, all these digressions. So we came to the conclusion that there is no difference. So migrants, second-generation migrants, and the Russians in the labor market make the same kind of money. That was first conclusion, because it means they integrated. They talk about the niches in the labor market. You would talk to us about such groups of migrants in the second generation do some special jobs, and that's kind of. So while from the Caucasus, so they are in retail. So then the Kyrgyz women and the middle and the Central Asia people, second generation migration, they are mostly in retail. So Kyrgyz mostly women, so then their niche is service industry, and restaurant. So they are cooks, so they are waiters, and so this is the structural integration. So they so they have this propensity of working in this area. So about education, Mr. Oturbayev was saying that migrants in second generation from the Central Asia, from Kyrgyzstan, specifically, so they're trying just to get education. But judging by the information, it's not true. It's not true, because talking about the second generation migrants from the Caucasus, it is true this is a group of highly educated people. So then more than half, every second generation migrant from the Caucasus gets higher education, much higher than other. But Central Asia, unfortunately, is much less. So only 25% of the Central Asian second generation migrants get higher education. Caucasus, 50%. And so then there are many cases when so then Central Asia, they even do not get a 9-year secondary education. So Then another opinion that migrants and the second generation migrants, so they form very closed-in societies. To what extent it's true? It's not true. That's it in general. They do not create these closed-in societies. But we can say that generally, no more than 30% or maybe 50%, if you talk about close friends, in the second generation migrants are representatives of the same ethnic category. So actually, but essential figure is 30%. So there's social integration. So that's usually, so they are much wider, and they do not only include the people of their own nation. Yeah, and so that's why then about cultural integration. There's a myth that the second generation, from the Caucasus, they do not change their values, so they can become ossified, and so they stick to the old traditions. That was the myth. But then a good conclusion, so that intergenerational dynamics, I mean the difference between the children and the fathers and mothers, it's very great difference. So moreover, so then actually, so there is this drifting to more liberal position, for example, concerning gender issues. They're becoming much more open and much more understandable and flexible. And so even just marriage prospects, who to marry, etc. So moreover, if you compare the indicators of cultural indicators between the groups of migrants, second generation migrants, so let me digress and say that our benchmark for comparison was this comparable young people, the youth, and we divided the youth into Russian, non-Russian youth, right? So that the study, so who said they are not Russians and they identify themselves, but their parents were born in Russia, and so then they were put as the local non-Russians. So the main conclusion is it's true that migrants of the second generation from the Caucasus, so they're more rigid and more conservative concerning the gender norms, but not much more rigid. The difference is very little, not because they're so liberal, but it's because Russia is not Moscow, and so then from the gender viewpoint, so they're very rigid as well. So Moscow is very flexible, very progressive, but it's different. And the last point I wanted to make concerning how they identify themselves. So to what extent the second generation migrants think themselves in Russia as at home, whether they feel themselves the representatives of their own nationality. Do they feel like that? So very briefly, we can conclude that this identification of migrants of the second generation, it's inclusive nature. They simultaneously value them being their own nation, but at the same time they feel at home in Russia at the same time. So then there is no problem with double identity. They didn't have that problem. And so then there are issues about local identities, mixed identities we can find as well. And generally we can conclude that the integration of the migrants of the second generation, roughly, so then in big brush strokes, so we can conclude, yes, it's true that the integration has taken place, but there are some challenges. For example, very often we can see the cases when the second generation migrants who do not have Russian citizenship, so they find themselves deported from Russia so even they are second generation, and then they have to spend 5 years in their own country before they are allowed just to come back to Russia. And so then you heard about that this Khachaturian sisters case, when 3 sister girls killed their own father, right? Because probably had been mistreating them for a long period of time. So logically, I mean that madness is social, and it's not the norm. This is deviation, definitely, because he was a bad guy, obviously. But he was a bad guy in a cultural realm, conservative cultural realm. So in accordance to his ideas, so they were supposed to stay at home, to be housemakers, to marry their own people. And so that was there. So this is the problem of the second generation female. So this we need to widen these organizations that help women, young women. And the law on domestic violence needs to be taken definitely. And then the last point, if I may. So they're asking to what extent this conflict in the CIS countries like Uzbeks and Kyrgyz and Bashir, or Armenians or Azerbaijanis and Karabakh, to what extent it is translated with the mutual hatred in the second generation in Russia. And our result is practically no transfer of hatred when they come to, but sometimes they wake up these conflicts. And so then there is a University of the Friendship of the Peoples nearby. And so Moscow made us friends, so there was a good event. So then the nationalities talk about their culture. And there the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis were pitted against each other because they asked us to remember who they are, about their national identity, and to group themselves, and then to stand against each other. Yeah. And so then that was born, that actually was part of this event. And this event actually was very telling because they started hating each other immediately right away. So that is why we transfer this culture onto the plane of family stories, then immediately the old hatreds and unhappiness floods back. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Женя, и спасибо всем докладчикам. Я считаю, что все просто уложили свое время.
So I thank you very much, and I thank all the presenters. You were very accurate. Unfortunately, we have very little time for questions, so that not to offend anyone, I take the liberty, I make a decision, and keep the right to ask a question. So, therefore, I have two short questions, one to Olga Chudinovskih, and now a law is in process about the residential right and the citizenship. Well, do you think the law will change the situation? And to follow up, is the zero result for investors and entrepreneurs, is it an economic reason of the present situation, or is it or probably the legislation matters is the reason? So thank you for the question. I never saw the draft law. I believe it's to follow up the draft laws after the first concept of the migration policy of 2012. I'm familiar with those projects, and they were being postponed. They kept being postponed many times. To change this system for temporary residence, I don't know if this option is kept in the new draft law, but in any case, we should welcome it, that the status of permanent residentship is now going to be reconsidered. And knowing the opinion of of the ministry, I believe that the proposals will be very constructive, and I hope they will be implemented very soon. As for the second question, yeah, entrepreneurs and investors, I think that the economic component is important. If you look at if you read the law, there are high economic thresholds that they don't motivate. They are rather restricting in investing, for the sake of permanent residence. And we still hope that investing, people will come and invest. And for that, it's not the citizenship that should serve as a bait, but simpler terms for the permanent residence. So my second question goes to Professor Sluchan. Is there data on the number of the people who got employment from the last wave of migration? And to follow up, what do you think is the reason for the difference in receiving migrants from, for instance, in Germany and Eastern country? Is it just economic development as a reason, or maybe there are other reasons for those differences?
Thank you very much. I think the main reason is the history of Germany. Because in the western part of Germany, we have a long tradition of guest worker tradition, guest worker which came in the 60s and 70s to the western part of Germany. And you know, Germany was divided until 1989, and we have no tradition of this kind of ethnic communities. We have in the eastern part of Germany a little bit of migrants from former socialist states like Angola, Vietnam, Cuba, Mozambique, and so on. But their number are very, very few in contrast to the huge number of the ethnic communities coming from Italy, Spain, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia. These all are countries with which the former West Germany had contracts to take guest workers. So we have a historical reason, and the other one is valid too. The economic development in Western Germany is still better than in the eastern part of Germany.
So the question on the share of the working migrants among all the migrants, do you have data on the employment of the last wave of migrants, the share of employed people who work officially?
Do you mean the last the Syrian refugees? I think concerning Syrian refugees. We have data then that nearly 1/3 of them are integrated in the labor market, but the asylum process takes a long time. If you can integrate into the labor market if you are accepted at asylum seeker, and if you come from Syria and Iraq, the rates are very high. They are between 85 to 19%. But if you are coming from West Balkan, so you have no chance for getting an asylum if you are coming from Kosovo and so on. So one of our recommendations was that we shouldn't mix asylum and labor market. They should apply as worker in different areas. For example, in areas in which lack in Germany, for service or construction and so on.
Спасибо большое. Мы вынуждены завершить.
Thank you very much. We have to wrap up because we need to provide the room for the next session. I thank everyone. I would like just to recap that from where I started, we live now in the new migration reality, new age, and we have to live with this reality as the presentations show for many years to come, and we need to adjust. We need to accept the changes and search for new migration donors and methods, and just remembering about the difficulties on the way of attracting migrants into the country. Shall I lecture you? I guess we never drank, together, no vodka together, so please be more respectful. Migration may be temporary or long-term migration. We were talking about long-period migration. It may be cursed, forced, voluntary migration. There are different types. Is it? Are we finished? Yep, thank you.